I didn't wake up one day and decide to raise my standards. There wasn't a moment where I said, okay, this is the new normal now. It was quieter than that. I think it started with watching other people live their lives and slowly letting that rewrite what mine was supposed to look like. What felt reasonable shifted without asking me. Prices that used to make me pause started to feel, expected. And I didn't notice it happening because nothing felt reckless. Nothing felt dramatic. I was still paying my bills, still doing fine technically, but somewhere along the way, my sense of enough stopped coming from my own numbers and started coming from what I saw around me. I told myself this was just adulthood, that this was me growing up. Looking back, I wasn't choosing a baseline at all. I was inheriting one. And the strange part is how calm it felt. While it was happening, no alarms, no warning. Just a slow adjustment I didn't question because everyone else seemed comfortable there already. I remember when a $10 lunch felt like a decision, not a crisis, just something I thought about. Now it barely registers. Somewhere between coworkers ordering delivery without blinking and friends casually mentioning $30 salads like they were gas prices, my definition of cheap changed. Not because I made more money, not because I sat down and recalculated anything. It changed because repetition does that. When you hear a number often enough, it stops sounding like a number and starts sounding like background noise. I didn't stop caring. I just stopped reacting. And that's the part that bothers me now, because nothing got better financially in that moment. I didn't suddenly feel more secure. I just felt smoother, less friction. And I mistook that for progress. It felt mature not to flinch anymore, like I'd leveled up. But all I really did was mute a signal that used to keep me honest. I didn't feel richer. I felt quieter. And at the time, that felt like the same thing. Housing was where it really started to sink in, even though I didn't admit it at the time. I remember scrolling listings and feeling a weird kind of embarrassment about places that would have thrilled me a few years earlier. They weren't bad. They just didn't match what everyone else seemed to have moved into. Bigger kitchens, nicer light, quieter streets. I told myself I'd earned that step up. That after a certain age, this was just what you did. What I didn't say out loud was that the numbers felt tight. Not impossible, just narrower. The rent fit, but barely, and only if nothing else went wrong. I signed anyway. Felt proud about it, too. Like I'd crossed some invisible line into a better version of adulthood. It took a while to notice how much breathing room I'd traded for that feeling. Square footage has a way of pretending it's neutral, like it's just space, but it carries expectations with it. And once your baseline shifts there, it's hard to imagine going back without feeling like you failed something you never agreed to in the first place. Cars were another one. Not the sticker price, I never liked looking at that part, but the monthly payment. Everyone talked in monthly payments. That was the language. So, that's what I compared. $200 more a month didn't sound that different when it was framed that way. It sounded manageable, especially when people around me were paying more and acting like it was nothing. Reliable, safe, sensible. Those were the words I used. What I didn't really sit with was how long that payment lasted. 5 years doesn't feel real when you're signing paperwork. It feels abstract. But 5 years of $300 extra a month is 18 grand. That number would have stopped me if I'd said it out loud. Instead, I kept it broken into smaller pieces so it wouldn't scare me. And I told myself this was just what responsible adults did. I didn't feel reckless driving that car. I felt normal. And somehow that made the cost feel invisible, even as it quietly reshaped everything else around it. Subscriptions slipped in without any resistance at all. $10 here, $12 there. Something bundled, something upgraded. It was always framed as small, always optional. And because nothing hurt individually, nothing felt worth canceling. I remember opening my bank app one night and scrolling past charges I barely recognized. All under $15. Music, shows, storage, convenience. It felt silly to even think about them. What was I going to do? Stress over $10? But $10 stacked 12 times is $120 a year. Stack that across 8 or 9 subscriptions, and suddenly you're looking at over $1,000 annually just to maintain access. Not ownership. Access. That math hit me later than it should have. At the time, it felt like adulthood came with a monthly cover charge, and everyone else had already paid it. The silence of those charges was the problem. They never asked permission again, and I stopped noticing them because noticing would have meant admitting how easily my baseline had accepted them as permanent. Eating out changed in a similar way. It wasn't about treating myself anymore. It became the default. Cooking started to feel like effort, like friction. Meeting up always meant a place, not a plan. And I went along with it because saying yes was easier than explaining why I didn't want to spend $25 on a casual meal. That's the part I don't love admitting. It wasn't hunger. It was comfort, social comfort. I didn't want to be the person who complicated things. So I paid to keep everything smooth. If you eat out 4 extra times a week at $20 a pop, that's $80. That's over $4,000 a year. I never ran that number while I was doing it. I just felt busy, tired, normal. And that's what made it stick. It didn't feel like splurging. It felt like participation. And once participation becomes the baseline, opting out starts to feel like a statement you didn't mean to make. Travel snuck in under the word quick. A quick weekend. A quick flight. A short reset. It never sounded expensive because it was never framed that way. Flights were only a few hundred. Hotels were reasonable. Everything was broken into parts that didn't look scary on their own. I remember putting a trip on my card and telling myself I'd deal with it later. Later always felt like a responsible plan. A weekend trip can easily run $1,000 by the time you add food, transportation, and the stuff you don't count because it feels like vacation spending. Do that a few times a year and you're quietly spending the equivalent of a decent emergency fund just to feel briefly reset. And the worst part is how justified it feels. Everyone needs a break. That's true, but I didn't notice how often I was borrowing relief from the future. It felt like living. It felt earned. It didn't feel like pressure until I got home and realized nothing had actually loosened. Clothes were another quiet shift. I stopped replacing things because they wore out and started replacing them because they didn't feel right anymore. Not stylish enough, not sharp enough. Not what people around me seemed to be wearing. I told myself it was professional. That appearance mattered. And it does, to a point. But $100 here and $100 there adds up faster than you think. I wasn't overhauling my wardrobe. I was just constantly adjusting it, keeping up, maintaining the version of myself that fit the room I was in. That's the dangerous part. Maintenance spending feels responsible, necessary even, but it never ends. There's always another upgrade, another replacement, and the baseline keeps creeping. I didn't feel flashy. I felt appropriate. And somehow that made it easier to ignore how much of my money was going toward looking like I belonged instead of actually feeling secure. Gifts were where obligation really started to cost me. Birthdays, weddings, showers, group gifts. There was always a suggested amount, even if no one said it directly. 50 felt low, 100 felt normal, 200 felt generous. And once that scale exists, it's hard to move down without feeling cheap. I don't regret giving to people I care about. What I regret is how automatic it became, how little space there was to ask myself what felt right. If you attend 5 weddings in a couple of years and spend $200 on each gift, that's $1,000. That's not counting travel, outfits, or time off work. It adds up quietly because it's framed as love, and love makes math uncomfortable. I remember feeling a twinge of resentment once and immediately pushing it away. That was the moment I should have paid attention. When generosity stops feeling voluntary, it's usually because your baseline has drifted past your comfort. Credit cards made all of this easier to ignore. Everyone had a balance. Everyone talked about points and miles and cash back like it canceled things out. Carrying a few thousand didn't feel alarming when it was common. But interest doesn't care how common something is. A $5,000 balance at 20% interest costs about $1,000 a year just to exist. I never said that number out loud while I was swiping. I just paid the minimum and told myself I was handling it. Handling it felt like maturity, But there was always a low-level tension under everything, like a hum I'd learned to tune out. Seeing other people live comfortably with debt made it feel less urgent, less personal. But shared normalization doesn't reduce the cost. It just spreads the silence around it. Tech upgrades were almost funny in hindsight. My phone worked. It just felt slow. Everyone else seemed to have something newer, smoother. So I upgraded. Not dramatically, just one model ahead. And then again a couple years later, $800 here, $900 there. Spread over payments, it felt harmless. But if you upgrade a phone every 2 years at $900, that's $4,500 over a decade. For marginal improvements, I never felt excited about the upgrade for long. Mostly, I felt relieved, like I'd fixed an irritation. That relief didn't last, but the cost did. And because everyone else was doing the same thing, it never felt like excess. It felt like staying current, like staying human in a fast-moving world. The baseline wasn't about having the best. It was about not feeling left behind. There was a point where I started using the phrase, "This is just how things are now." That's a dangerous sentence. It shuts down curiosity. It turns choices into inevitabilities. Rent is just high now. Food is just expensive. Life costs more. All true to a degree. But I used that framing to stop questioning my own part in it. I stopped asking whether my version of normal was something I wanted or something I'd absorbed. It felt grown up to accept it. Resigned even. But resignation has a price. When you stop noticing how your baseline formed, you lose the ability to tell which parts are necessary and which parts are just inherited habits. I wasn't reckless, I was passive. And passivity can be expensive in ways that don't show up as emergencies, just as a constant feeling of being slightly behind. Social media didn't help, even when I wasn't thinking about it. You don't need ads for comparison to work. You just need repetition. Seeing trips, dinners, homes, upgrades, all compressed into highlights, recalibrates what feels ordinary. I'd catch myself feeling behind without knowing what race I was even in. That feeling leaks into spending, not consciously, subtly. You start justifying little upgrades because they feel overdue, deserved. I really thought, I want what they have. It was more like, why doesn't my life look that smooth? And money becomes the quiet bridge between that question and a temporary answer. The dangerous part is how invisible the influence feels. It doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like inspiration. And inspiration doesn't come with a receipt. Convenience became its own category of spending. Faster shipping, premium seats, paying to skip lines, paying to not wait. Each one felt like a small kindness to myself. And maybe it was. But small kindnesses add up. If you pay an extra $5 here, $10 there just to make things easier, that can easily turn into hundreds a month, thousands a year. I didn't track it because it didn't feel like a habit. It felt like relief. I was tired. Everyone was tired. And money became a tool to shave off tiny annoyances. The problem is that annoyance always finds new places to live. So the spending never ends, it just moves. And I didn't want to look too closely at that because it would have meant admitting how much I was paying just to feel slightly less irritated. There was a moment that finally made me pause. I don't even remember what the purchase was. I just remember thinking, this would have stressed me out before, and it didn't anymore. That should have felt like progress. Instead, it felt hollow, like I'd crossed a line without noticing. When did this become normal? When did this stop registering? That was uncomfortable, not because I'd spent the money, but because I couldn't feel it anymore. That numbness scared me more than the expense. It meant my internal signals had adjusted. And once your baseline shifts enough, the absence of discomfort stops being reassuring. It starts feeling like something's missing. Even when my income went up, it didn't fix this. That surprised me. Raises felt good for about a month, then everything settled again. The new number just became the floor for new expectations. A slightly nicer place, slightly better food, slightly more convenience. The pressure didn't leave. It just changed shape. That's when it hit me that this wasn't about income, it was about calibration. If your baseline is set by external reference points, it will always expand to fill whatever you earn. And you'll keep wondering why more never feels like enough. I didn't feel irresponsible. I felt confused, like I'd done the right things and still couldn't catch my breath. What made it harder was how little anyone talked about it honestly. Everyone seemed fine, comfortable. So I assumed they were. No one admits they're stretched. No one says they're uncomfortable. So silence reinforces the idea that your baseline must be right if you're the only one feeling pressure. That isolation is powerful. It keeps you from questioning, from recalibrating. I thought something was wrong with me for feeling tight. It took a long time to realize that everyone else might have been feeling the same thing and just not saying it. Shared silence doesn't mean shared comfort. It just means no one wants to be the first to admit the math isn't working. One night, I finally ran a number I'd been avoiding. Just one habit, nothing dramatic. Delivery a few times a week. About $25 an order. Let's say 3 times a week. That's $75. Times 52 weeks is just under $4,000 a year. For food I could have made. That number landed heavier than I expected. $4,000 isn't catastrophic, but it's not nothing. And that was just one habit, one line item. That was the part I didn't want to look at first, not because it was shocking, but because it was ordinary. It meant my baseline had quietly committed thousands of dollars a year without ever asking me. There was resistance when I started noticing all this. Emotional resistance. A part of me didn't want to touch it because changing a baseline isn't just financial, it's social. It means being slightly out of sync, slightly inconvenient, slightly different, and that can feel risky. Familiar patterns feel safe, even when they're expensive. I realized how much of my spending was tied to identity, to not wanting to stand out and to not wanting to feel behind or cheap or difficult. That's uncomfortable to admit, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And I didn't have a clean answer for what to do with that awareness. Now it usually hits me late at night. Just checking an account. Nothing dramatic, no panic, just a quiet moment where I notice how full everything feels. Not full in a good way, just crowded, like there's no space left to breathe. I don't know what my real baseline is anymore, or if I ever chose one. I just know the number that keeps replaying in my head isn't a big one. It's a small one. A few $100s a month, a few thousand a year, not enough to ruin you, just enough to wear you down over time. And that's the part that lingers. How something so ordinary can feel so heavy once you finally stop and notice it.